Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, bringing to you a very, very special episode. A few days ago the lovely people at Dotemu reached out to me and kindly gifted me a free copy of Streets of Rage 4, which was a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. They also supplied me with access to a range of information and footage so that I could make one of the most in-depth videos on this game on the entirety of the information superhighway. So, as you know, we have already looked at the original trilogy recently in great depth, and what each entry in the series brought to the table. So, after 26 years of waiting, it's finally time for us all to experience the next exciting entry in the Streets of Rage series. Today we are going to take an in-depth look at the development history of this new game, give you my thoughts on this brand new title, and look at the game's overall critical reception online thus far. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Streets of Rage 4, a long-held fantasy for some that has finally come true. Yeah! 29 years ago, Streets of Rage would see a release on the Sega Mega Drive. The game was instantly special and a crowd pleaser due to the fact that the game was a system exclusive that played like the popular Final Fight, but actually offered two-player cooperative play, something that the home version of Final Fight on the Super Nintendo failed to offer consumers. This all unfolded in 1991. But the best was yet to come, as 1992 would see the release of Streets of Rage 2, a huge, technically impressive game worked on by multiple development teams that arguably topped the action that could be found in the first Streets of Rage game in every category. In fact, the title is so good that many people look at it as the greatest Sega game ever made. The classic trilogy was rounded off in 1994 with the release of Streets of Rage 3. Whilst not as popular a game as that of which came before it, the title still brought a lot to the table, including more playable characters than ever before, and multiple unlockables. Sadly though, this would be the last Streets of Rage game ever released, or at least so we thought. Over the years, Streets of Rage programmer and composer Yuzo Koshiro claims he has rallied Sega for a fourth Streets of Rage game, each time never getting the green light. Others have attempted to get the Streets of Rage license for their own games in the past too. For example, Core Design's title Fighting Force. It was a 3D beat-em-up that was created in 1997 with the hope that they would be able to call their game Streets of Rage 4. Ruffian Games, the developer behind Crackdown 2, also tried its hand at a reboot on the Xbox 360 and PS3, but all of these efforts ultimately failed. In the end, fans had come to the conclusion that it was in their best interest to look at the ambitious fan project known as Streets of Rage Remake as the closest thing they were ever going to get to a fourth Streets of Rage entry. This was until a series of fortunate events that would unfold that would eventually lead to a Streets of Rage 4 becoming a reality. To understand why Streets of Rage 4 was published, we first have to briefly look at a game that was developed prior. We have to start with the development house known as Lizard Cube. Programmer Omar Coolnut and artist Ben Fiquet reverse engineered the Master System code, which would lead them to work with Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon Trap's original game designer Ryuichi Nishizawa in producing a remake of the original game. Fiquet single-handedly and painstakingly reproduced all of the game's original art and animation, depicting it in a modern art style. The whole feat was extremely impressive, leaving gamers to wonder what Lizard Cube would be up to next. Whilst the Wonder Boy title was developed by Lizard Cube, the game was actually published by a fellow French company known as Dotemu. According to their website, their mission statement is as follows. Dotemu is a French video game company specialising in modern releases of beloved retro games. Our mission is simple: give every gamer access to yesteryear's classic video games on today's platforms, including PC, mobile, console and more. Working alongside the world's most cherished and recognised publishers, the Dotemu team has published a number of global top sellers across both PC and console, including Wonder Boy The Dragon's Trap, Windjammers, several games in the Yeast series and more. Founded in 2007, Dotemu leverages its considerable technological know-how to maintain the original spirit of classic games while giving them a second life as rediscovered gems for a new generation of gamers. The critical response to Wonder Boy 3 The Dragon's Trap, and what Lizardcube and Dotemu managed to impressively do with such an old license, was finally enough to earn Sega's trust to be allowed to develop a Streets of Rage 4. The collaborative effort between Lizardcube and Dotemu would also be aided by a company known as Guard Crush Games, who would oversee the gameplay elements of a brand new beat-em-up. They were chosen to partake in the project due to their passion for classic beat-em-ups and side-scrolling titles. The team is best known for its Xbox 360 release Streets of Fury and follow-up on the PC Streets of Fury Extended Edition in 2015. Which revel in over-the-top action and capture the studio's love for fun side-scrolling brawlers. So, was all of this the perfect recipe to make Streets of Rage 4 the special game fans desired? Let's look at the development history and look at exactly what was put into this. Yeah! The game's artists had a tall challenge to take on, and that was to come up with artwork which they felt would best represent the Streets of Rage series in 2020. This job was overseen by Lizardcube's art director Ben Fouquet and lead background artist Julian Nguyen. Ben Fouquet states that after Wonder Boy, The Dragon's Trap, which we did in association with Dotemu, we wanted to bring back some games that we really liked, and for me, Streets of Rage, which was a Sega license and which I particularly liked, came to mind right away. Artistically speaking, in Streets of Rage, there are lots of things which are ingrained, like the urban feel, the neon, the bricks and the ground. Those have really stayed strong in our memories, and I think it has always been an underlying inspiration as soon as you think of characters fighting in the streets. Very quickly we have had the idea of showing the story and the characters at a later time. The story takes place 10 years after Streets of Rage 3, because the fans who have been waiting for this sequel for a long time have gotten older, have grown up, and the whole thing with these young, fiery kids in the streets wasn't working any longer with the way the fans are now. For a lot of people, the first level ties in with that Streets of Rage feeling you used to have, because I think that's the level where you spent the most time. Julian Nguyen adds in relation to this stage, that is where players spend the most time. Also, that's where they tried things. They added a corner, which was very difficult to do at the time. We tried to pay homage to that in the structure of the first level in level 1 of Streets of Rage 4. Ben Fouquet adds, the way we thought of it was really as a tribute, in particular to Streets of Rage 2, with that street corner, with the car that crashes into the wall, which was something they wanted to do and was in the game design documents of the original games, and that they weren't actually able to do because of technical limitations. So here we wanted to pay homage to all that. In regards to character designs, Ben mentions that if you look at the original blueprints of character designs from the 90s, that the developers were forced to use pixel art due to limitations of the period, where now they could represent the characters in the game in the original manga art style developers would have originally opted for, if the technology was there. The use of heavy black lines around the characters also pay homage to the originals on paper character designs. Ben also comments on working on a game with such high expectations, stating, "This is a game which holds a special place in a lot of fans' hearts, and there's a fine line between pleasing people and creating something new. The thing that I'm very happy about is that the fans thank us a lot, and there is a huge number of fans who are delighted to have a new Streets of Rage and a new game which seems to them to be very high quality, at least at this stage. So I hope we won't disappoint them." The game's main designer is a gentleman known as Jordi Asensio. Jordi was an early active member in the fighting game community, who as a result was also drawn to beat-em-ups, with a particular special love for Guardian heroes. Speaking on Streets of Rage 4, he mentions that making a sequel is one of the hardest things to do. You must first figure out what was so good about the original games. Jordi views Streets of Rage 2 as the ultimate entry in the Streets of Rage series, so chose to design the gameplay featured in Streets of Rage 4 around the second entry. In fact, he even states that I try to control both of them simultaneously to make sure I can match them in terms of rhythm and feeling. Nowadays we have a really mechanical idea of what game design must be. It has to be really precise, but this is just one part of the job. Another point is that game design is a way of consuming the content of the game. He states that the game's feel and level of ease it was to work on was hugely helped by Guard Crush Games' fantastic engine he was provided with to work on. Head of Programming Cyril Lagariga mentions the engine was based off of one previously used when they released Streets of Fury EX on the Xbox 360. They would improve it a lot though for Streets of Rage 4. Geordie claims that we discussed every possible question about beat-em-ups. We also analysed fighting games frame by frame to understand which tools we needed exactly. We tried to rebuild it all. We tried to think like the game makers from that time, and with the modern technology that we have nowadays. We tried to create a tool which allowed us to develop this type of game on a top level. When you create a sequel of a game, you shouldn't be overexcited. The common mistake is trying to add today's trends. You don't need to implement RPG mechanics, you don't want to over-modernise the game. You need to understand the frustrations of that time and to figure out if these frustrations were due to technical limitations or idea limitations. In regards to working on such a huge project, Geordie rounds off with, at the beginning you don't realise the pressure because you're working on the game of your dreams. So you are very motivated, and then, after the first announcement, when you start showing things, the fans begin to react in every sense of the word. On one hand it motivates you because some find it really cool, but on the other hand people criticise you quite harshly. But you must accept that because there are always reasons behind criticism. It's very important to look at what people do and say, even if sometimes it hurts, and to analyse where this feeling comes from. Meanwhile, the pressure gets harder, but since the game is good, it's fine. So we have now looked at both the creation of a game's art direction and gameplay, but what of the music? One of the most standout features of previous Streets of Rage games. In regards to this, Olivier de Riviere was brought on board by Cyril Imbert as the game's main composer. He states that the idea was we needed an artist who could do most of the music, but in a very special and modern way, but in the same spirit as was in the previous series, and that when we started to think about Olivier de Riviere, looking at his work, looking at everything he did in his different works in the past, so he can create something that gets the perfect fusion of gameplay and music. Streets of Rage is all about the fusion of gameplay and music. Playing Streets of Rage is like listening to an album, but an interactive album. Olivier de Riviere, in his new role, straight away decided he did not want to replicate the works of Yuzo Koshiro because he felt he could not do a good job of replicating someone else's unique music on the basis that it would feel wrong to everybody. So it was not to be disrespectful, but also to let him have his own take as he too was part of this project. Yuzo could inject his own flavour into Streets of Rage 4. Speaking of the return of Streets of Rage, during the game's development, Yuzo Koshiro commented that Streets of Rage came out on the Mega Drive, however, it wasn't that popular in Japan. It performed better in the United States and Europe. To be honest, I had pitched a sequel to the series a few times, however Sega wasn't interested at the time. It was about 20 years ago. I find it interesting that a French team is working on it today. It is exciting to see a new modern day Streets of Rage game not coming from Japan, but from overseas. Motohiro Kawashima and I used to work on the Streets of Rage series by ourselves. I am interested to see the musical universe resulting from a collaboration between multiple artists. All of them are obviously very talented musicians and composers, so I expect the result to be a truly enjoyable sound. Amongst the many musicians working on the game, these included Shimomura, a former Capcom employee. In regards to her, Yuzo states that, I find it funny because Shimomura used to work on Street Fighter 2. Originally, Sega president at the time ordered that we do better than Street Fighter 2 with Streets of Rage. It is funny because this was our starting point when working on the game. I felt it is a strange turn of events that I end up working with Shimomura, who was working on that game at the time. Motohiro Kawashima, another man who worked on the original trilogy's legendary soundtrack, adds, "I already completed 2 tracks. Back in the day we were aiming at creating new sounds using the built-in systems of the 90s. Working now on Streets of Rage 4, I wondered whether pursuing new sounds was the right answer. Originally, we made what we wanted to make, which gave Streets of Rage. However, I realised that making what I want to make now wouldn't give the same result, which is why I felt a bit troubled at the start. I listened back to the original Streets of Rage, wondering what made the essence of the game. I then came up with an answer. I felt that Streets of Rage wasn't based on melodies. It was phrases woven with each other, like parts knitted together. I wondered how to express that Streets of Rage sound, then worked on recreating that universe with today's tools." Yuzo Koshiro continues the conversation by adding, "Originally the Streets of Rage music is heavily inspired by club music from the late 80s to early 90s. Working on the project today, I wondered on the approach to take, whether it should be modern using EDM for example. I thought about it, then came to the conclusion that I should be creating things that I wasn't able to make at the time. Also, looking at the fans' opinions on the internet, I saw many of them were expecting a sound close to the original. I thought that using the same original tools could be a good approach as well. I reused the synths and drum machines of the time. I reused them, recorded the sound, then made the song in a serious way. While working on Streets of Rage 4, I listened to the music that influenced me on Spotify and YouTube. I wanted to feel again what drove me at that time." According to Olivier Riviere, the head composer himself, he states that each boss fight in the game consists of a different track composed by different musicians to make each fight feel more special. He also mentions that he and the other composers spent a lot of time working alongside the game's designers to work out their intentions throughout each intricate part of the game. This helped make the music more consistent with players' experiences. Music was designed so that it would increase players' adrenaline as they progressed through the stages. Olivier summarises in regards to working on the music that working on Streets of Rage 4 was the scariest thing he has ever done in his life, and it was frightening in every aspect. He said it was a huge honour, he did the best he could and hopes players enjoy it, but it is very difficult to come after such legendary composers, and as a result is very grateful to have been part of the whole project. So now we have looked in depth at how the game come to be, along with its development cycle. I guess it's time to start discussing what players will find once in possession of this game. For the first time in an official Streets of Rage entry, Streets of Rage 4 offers up to 4-player cooperative play, which can be experienced locally. In fact, the game also allows for online play with 2-player cooperative, another brand new element for the franchise. Like in Streets of Rage games of the past, the objective is simple. Players fight their way through stages, taking out wave after wave of enemies. A lot of the usual features are back too, such as disposable weapons and items to pick up, which can be used to gain points or restore health. In addition to this, there are also stars that players can pick up which relate to being able to execute a technique known as star moves, which we shall get to in a moment. Players have the ability to perform standard attacks, throws, blitz moves and more powerful special attacks at the cost of a small portion of the user's health. In a new feature, it is possible to restore spent health on these special attacks by performing successive follow-up attacks without getting hit. The game features a nice counting system that records how many successful attacks you can land in a row, which gives you a little extra added motivation for not being hurt by your opponents. This new combo system also allows players to satisfyingly juggle opponents against walls and other players. In regards to the star moves, which can be performed by collecting the stars in each level, these are powerful attacks, a bit like the summoning of the police car in the series' original entry. The game's main gameplay mode is known as Story Mode, where players make their way through the story, fighting their way through 12 beautiful stages, each with their own unique boss encounter at the end of each gauntlet. How challenging this experience is depends on which difficulty setting players choose. There are 5 options in total, ranging from easy to mania, which dictate the experience players are going to be delivered with. If you want to beat the game with little in the way of a competition, then easy mode is for you. But if you're a complete sadist, mania is there for all players if they want to attempt it. An interesting feature that this game has introduced is the title's lifetime score. Players are awarded points based on how much they challenge themselves, and after reaching each point milestone in the game's lifetime scoring system, new unlockables become available, giving the game not just an edge of replayability, but an extra incentive for players to challenge themselves more too. This game is as much about the carrot as it is the stick. Unlike the traditional Streets of Rage games of old, in story mode, which is a new feature in general anyway, when a game over screen is reached, players can save the game and try the stage they are stuck on as many times as they like. Difficulty is determined not just by how tough the enemies are or how many items are available, but also the amount of lives players start with at the beginning of each stage. To give players even more incentive to keep plugging away at this game is the fact that upon clearing each stage, ranks are given to the player based on how many points they could score, leading to the desire of playing the same stages over and over again. Away from the story mode, there is also an arcade mode, which plays more like the Streets of Rage games of old, where players must make their way through the entire game with a limited amount of lives. There is also a level select so that players can practice whatever stage they like. A battle mode, which basically acts as a mini fighting game feature where players fight against each other, and a boss rush mode to fight against the game's bosses. There are a lot of options here, and even an extras section which acts like a gallery for players to look at concept art and sprites designs. Nice. Now there is so much to undress here, it is tough to do a video on a game that has been 26 years in the making. We have a lot to get through today. This obviously includes the characters themselves. Initially at the beginning of a playthrough, gamers have the choice of 4 different fighters, each of which have their own unique moves, abilities and advantages control wise, so let's cover who's featured in this game. First we have Axel Stone from the original entry in the series. Due to the 10-year storyline time gap between this game and Streets of Rage 3, he is depicted as older and more grizzled, this time featuring a massive beard. Classic character Blaze also makes a return to this game, not looking wildly different than before, but perhaps having much thicker legs and hips. Childbearing. The other 2 instantly selectable characters are brand new to the franchise. First we have the heavyweight of the game, Floyd O'Rea, a softly spoken cybernetically enhanced apprentice of Dr. Zan, who was one of the playable fighters from the 3rd entry in the series. We also have a young woman known as Cherry Hunter, who, as you can guess by her surname, is a relative of Adam Hunter, who was only previously playable in the first game in the series 29 years ago. The story soon reveals that Cherry is Adam's daughter, and speaking of Adam, he quickly becomes a selectable fighter too, who becomes available as the game's first unlockable. Playable fighters don't end here though, and pixel art versions from previous games can also be unlocked as players build up their lifetime score, both embracing and celebrating the franchise's storied history. Whilst most of the previous game's characters are selectable in pixel form, I was disappointed that neither Rue or Ash were included as selectable fighters. Instead, they were reduced to cameos, with Rue featuring behind a bar in one stage and Ash appearing in a picture in the background whilst one of the boss fights takes place. Here's hoping then, I guess, that they become accessible via the use of future DLC updates. So now we have discussed many of this game's features, let's address an elephant in the room. The game's artistic direction, and the main element that gamers criticised about Streets of Rage 4 prior to the game's release. Many felt that the art style represented in Wonder Boy 3 was fine, but it's not really the same art style many Streets of Rage fans ever really fantasised about with their franchise. Listening to the artists talk about this game, it becomes more clear as to why they chose the direction they did, especially when you take into account how the original trilogy's concept art looked before it was pixelised. Looking at the artwork in this game, I can fully appreciate how it is not for everyone, but at the same time I can also sympathise with the fact that the original Streets of Rage games only featured a pixel art style due to the extreme limitations technology provided artists with in the early 90s. So, when you consider that the original Streets of Rage trilogy were Japanese games, the manga sort of aesthetic that was given to this game makes a lot more sense. The only argument I would place against this personally is that Streets of Rage was never that popular in Japan, and design wise was always more appealing to Westerners than it ever was Eastern. So holding this thought in mind, if I oversaw the production of this game, I would have certainly ordered it to be produced with a more Western oriented art style. But I am nitpicking at this point and can see that it was a case of trying to reproduce the original artist's designs with a more modern flair. The stage design itself is both beautiful and varied with a level of detail we obviously just did not get back in the day. The hand-drawn artwork is simply stunning, especially when paired with the multi-layered scrolling effects the game presents in its backgrounds. There is just so much to see and take in that I feel is going to take dozens upon dozens of playthroughs to truly appreciate. In terms of the game's enemy sprites, many of them appear to be redrawn versions of enemies of old, which helps give the game an additional layer of nostalgia for those who have been long-time fans, but at the same time enough polish to please those who have never played a game like this before. Like Streets of Rage of old, each of these levels have their own boss fights, each of which have their own unique attack patterns which must be learned by players in order to be more easily defeated. Many of these boss fights take place against completely new opponents, whereas others take place against classic opponents of old. In fact, one of these opponents is even Max, a beloved playable character from Streets of Rage 2, who must be defeated here. I have to say, the fact that a new fully drawn version of Max appears in this game, yet is not a selectable character in this form, is kind of baffling. The same goes for Shiva as well actually, which means that I would bet my money that both of these become paid DLC selectable characters in our future. Something we have not touched on really is this game's story, which revolves around another criminal organisation, this time known as the Y Syndicate, who even seem to have the police wrapped around their fingers to some degree. Speaking of this element, this brings another feature along with it. The game seems to contain two different types of enemy sprites, those who are members of the Y Syndicate and those who are in the police. These two types of sprites, although both hostile to the player, are also hostile and attack one another, an element I have not seen in a beat 'em up since Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, an element I have never seen included in any Streets of Rage games previously. It unfolds in the story that the leaders of the Y Syndicate are a twin brother and sister who are actually son and daughter of Mr. X himself, which is why they are so hell-bent on getting revenge against the city. Again, just a personal gripe with regards to these two. They are not at all imposing like their father, but instead look anime as hell and simply look like selectable characters from a Persona game or something, rather than a title with a bit of early 90s attitude like Streets of Rage. Once again, I am nitpicking here, but I feel they seem completely out of place in this environment. Speaking of Mr. X, he along with several other vintage bosses from the Streets of Rage series are accessible to fight against in pixel form. These fights are accessible via entering secret areas and feature in the game as fantastic hidden Easter eggs, giving an even further nod to the franchise's awesome past. Now, we touched on the game's controls earlier and how they connected back to Streets of Rage 2, but what I have not mentioned is how they feel. The controls paired with the game's sound effects and combo systems make Streets of Rage 4 feel like one of the most satisfying beat 'em up experiences I have ever had. It feels so good to pummel opponents watching that hit count quickly mount up. Truly wonderful. A question I posed a few months ago was that I was doubtful that Streets of Rage 4 could live up to the fantastic fan game known as Streets of Rage Remake. And from my findings of thus far, from my personal perspective at least, I can 100% confirm it absolutely does. I am addicted to this game and cannot wait to play it more once I've finished work on this upload. The game is just that fun. But that's enough about me for now. Let's have a quick look at what the major game publications have made of this game. After all, they are meant to be the true experts in the field, who are supposed to be most trusted with their judgment. IGN would state Streets of Rage 4 is a faithful revival of the classic arcade beat-em-ups. Move from left to right, punch enemies, destroy objects for points, health and weapon pickups, punch a few more enemies and repeat. It's simple and unadventurous, and while it expands modestly on combat with a few new skills to master, Streets of Rage 4 definitely prioritises nostalgia over any kind of big modern reinvention. Streets of Rage 4 delivers the greatest hits of the classic series and is at its best when played with at least one friend. If the primary focus was delivering a traditional Streets of Rage experience with a modern coat of paint, it absolutely succeeds. But while it layers on a few new and interesting mechanics, it's still a very conservative update to the quarter-century-old format that feels like a slave to the past. So, as you can see, IGN would give this game a very average response, awarding the game a 7 out of 10. Heavily criticising the game due to a lack of reinvention and too much nostalgia reliance. I, on the other hand, could not feel that their statement is further from the truth. I am a man who has been looking at Golden Age era beat-em-ups weekly for months on this channel, and I can certainly confirm that this game does not present players with just a nostalgia trip. In fact, as I have mentioned earlier, that could not be further from the truth, as the game very much feels like something new and very little like what was available in the 90s. In my opinion, Streets of Rage 4 builds on the old formula and modernises it for new players. The fact that the game features save states so that players are not expected to finish the game in one sitting, contains a boatload of achievements for repeat play, and features an easy mode so that players can beat the game in just over 1 hour if they choose, is enough alone to suggest that the game is certainly not a nostalgia trip, but instead looking to cater to modern gaming habits. An arcade mode is present for those who do want an old school arcade experience, but the game certainly seems designed for everyone rather than just us old boys. The game perfectly marries up some of the tropes of the classic beat 'em up genre with a modern art style, new play mechanics and a plethora of reasons to play through the same stages over and over. Beat 'em ups were simply about relentless challenge and pattern memorization. There are a lot more layers than that present here, so I am not quite sure what IGN was smoking when reviewing this high quality game. Anyway, let's look at how Destructoid summarised their findings. Over 25 years since its last official entry, Streets of Rage is finally ready to make its long awaited, highly anticipated return. The 16-bit era was an entire lifetime ago, and action games have advanced far beyond the traditional arcade brawler of yore. Is there even a place for Blaze and crew in the modern gaming age? You bet there is, Jack. It's almost impossible to imagine a Streets of Rage devotee not being delighted with this sequel. It has the depth of combat and variance of character for dedicated fans to sink their teeth into, while at its chaotic quick-fix action and co-op multiplayer offers even the most casual enthusiast a solid experience. Streets of Rage 4's gratifying gameplay and fair price tag make this a purchase worth anyone's cash. Streets of Rage 4 is an absolute triumph. It looks stunning, it sounds sublime, and it plays like a dream. Streets of Rage 4 delivers fistfuls of knockdown, drag-out action for fans old and new, all at a modest price. It's been a long wait for the Streets of Rage faithful, but comebacks rarely get much better than this. Grand upper! So the journalists over at Destructoid seemed to be equally as impressed with this game as myself, and did not write the game off as a nostalgia trip, like IGN made the decision to do for some reason. Bizarre. It's funny how contrasting these opinions seem to be, considering they are all meant to be fairly non-biased reviews. Looking at the review scores across the board, the game seemed to have received mostly critical love, with most big gaming publications falling into the same boat as myself and Destructoid. It only seems to be IGN and Game Informer who have extra layers of criticism for the game, with them stating, it doesn't have the hooks to keep you coming back. This beat 'em up feels like a homage to the 90s, but it's also stuck in that era. Again, sentiments I completely disagree with due to all the extra features I mentioned that were not part of the genre back then. So, from me, Streets of Rage 4 gets a massive thumbs up, and I now fully trust Dotemu, Lizardcube and Guard Crush Games with the development of a Streets of Rage 5 if they can make a sales success with this one. The game was one of those rare cases of living up to the hype. Something that came as a surprise to me, considering how infrequently that seems to happen these days. So I could not recommend Streets of Rage 4 to you enough. Now, if you are still here, I would like to thank you all for listening to me talk about this game for so long. There was just so much to get through due to this title being 26 years in the making. Part of my motivation to go into such depth when it comes to these videos is partially down to my extremely supportive Patreon following, who through thanks to them means that this channel is mostly funded by Patreon so that I can make videos for the world to see full time. Now I am offering a huge amount of incentives to those who go the extra mile to support this channel, which apart from exclusive videos and more, this also includes end credits closing off these videos. So massive shout outs go out to Sebastian Veles, Carl Johnson, Heo, Paulo Lopez, Joseph Razmek, Doug Perkins, Ego, Alethea Swanson, Angel Light 85, Asobi Kwang DX, Azrael Warakai, Brian Barry, Cambo Rambo 82, Carlos Domingos, Computer Man, Daniel Daly, ECU Professor, Gary Pinkett, Gianni V Santizi, Glenny Glenn, Hamid Musa, House of the Ted, Joaquin Varela, Jordan Durant, Heo Vinagre, Keith Ferguson, Lars Zondervan, Matthew Robertson, Michael Cullix, Philip Manth, Prince Knight, Princess Zana, Sponge Matt B, TOG Driver, Since Spaces, A Murder of Crows, Adam Castin, Adrian Hannington, Andis Reinsberg, Andrew Bazanski, Andrew Pearson, Antonio Rodriguez, Bernard G, Barbara Kitty, Chris Fisk, Chris Margarine, Chris Cool, Craig Jenkins, Crazy Yao, Dan Barlow Jr., Francesco Lacriola, Gregory Smoragiewicz, Hans Christian, Ivan M, Jake Whitford, James Bishop, James McDonald, JB, Jazzy Tay, Joel, John Bates, Casey Wright, Kings Knight, Langston Miller, Lobster Puncher, Luis Viant, Luke Canava, Marco Soto, Marvin Aroliga, Master Jinx, Matthew Rindle, Me Machine Dean, Michael Hall, Mike Bruno, Noob, Paul Elliott, Posty XL, Punky Dudester, Retroversion.com, Richard Stu Stewart, Rick67, Ron Stud, Sarah Powell, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Stephen Lewis, Time Lord Soundwave, Tom Elliott, Vlamink Renee, Wazzo Junks, Zai. So thank you to all of those people and all of my other patrons. You make running this channel such an honour. Yeah. Yippee.